Good morning to all of you, and yeah, let us begin today's lecture. Okay, so in the last lecture, we saw some more concepts that related to Turing machines. So, in particular, we looked at different restrictions and extensions of Turing machines, right, which are sort of different models of Turing machines. So, we saw, for example, a Turing machine with a tape that is just infinite in one direction, which is a semi-infinite tape. Right? And we said that this is as powerful as a Turing machine with a tape infinite in both directions. Right? And similarly, we also saw some extensions of the standard Turing machine model. Right? So these were Turing machines with multiple tapes, right? Where each of the tapes, right, can be operated independently. Right? As I said, there are multiple read heads which can move around independently on each of the tape heads. And then we saw a non-deterministic Turing machine, right? And we also saw that in real computers, right, can be thought of as Turing machines, right? In the sense that a Turing machine can simulate a real computer as well. Right? So all of these models, right, of Turing machine are basically equivalent to each other in terms of their language-defining power. Right? So that these extra capabilities don't really add uh, any power uh, to the language defining ability, right? And then we also saw some closure properties of Turing machines, right? So it's very easy to see that Turing machines are like rather the languages, right, that are defined by Turing machines, right? If you take this language class, which is the class of recursively enumerable languages, then this is closed under standard operations like union, intersection, uh, concatenation, reversal, star, and so on, right? However, the class of recursive languages, right, which is the class of uh, languages which is defined by Turing machines, which are total, right, or which are algorithms, which means which always halt for any input, right? So this class of recursive languages differs slightly from the class of recursively enumerable languages, right, in that recursively enumerable languages are not closed under complementation and difference, while recursive languages are closed. Okay. So today, right, we will take a more closer look, right, at this difference between the class of recursive and the class of recursively enumerable languages, right, and we will also demonstrate a language which is not recursively enumerable, right, which means which cannot be accepted by any Turing machine, right, which probably means that it cannot be accepted by any computer, right, built now or built in the future. So this is the topic of decidability. Okay, so let's move ahead with this. So as I said, uh, the focus of this topic is to answer questions like these, right? So are there languages which are not recursively enumerable, right? And are there languages which are recursive but not recursively enumerable, right? Which means languages which can be accepted only by rather languages which can be accepted by some Turing machine but not by a total Turing machine, right? Or not by an algorithm, right? So from a practical point of view, this question is very important. Okay. Uh, so as we build up to this, right? So we need to revise some of the concepts that you must have learned earlier, right? In earlier courses, right? So let's revise and recall some of these concepts, right? So first of all, let's look at finite sets, right? So finite sets are very straightforward, right? So set, right? So a set is a finite set if its cardinality, right, or number of members of the set is finite, right? Which means that there is a particular integer that is the count of the number of members. Right? So then a set is called finite, right? So for example, take the set ABC, then it clearly has only three elements, right? So the number of members in the set is finite, right? Which is an integer 3. Right? So its cardinality is 3, and therefore it is a finite set. Okay. Another property of finite set is that it is impossible to find a one-to-one mapping between a finite set and a proper subset of itself. Right? So, which means that if you take a finite set, right, and then you take a subset, a proper subset of that finite set, then the proper subset is guaranteed to have a lower cardinality, right? Have a lesser number or fewer number of elements or fewer number of members in the lower set, or rather in the smaller set, right, in the subset. So that's why it's impossible to find a one-to-one mapping between a finite set and a proper subset of itself. Right? So the reason that this property is sort of relevant, right, is because this is what differentiates a finite set from an infinite set. So the definition of an infinite set, in fact, is that an infinite set is a set for which there is a one-to-one correspondence between itself and a proper subset of itself. So if you take a set that is if you take a set that is infinite, right, and if you take, so there exists a proper subset of that infinite set, such that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the set itself and the subset. So when we say about a one-to-one correspondence, right, what we mean is that there is a one-to-one, there is a function, right, which is one-to-one and on-to. Right? So that's what we mean by a correspondence, right, a one-to-one correspondence. So for example, right, if you take the set of positive integers, which is the set 1, 2, 3, and so on, right. So this set is an infinite set, and the reason is that it has a proper subset. In fact, it has many proper subsets. For which such that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the set itself and the proper subset, right? So an example is, let's consider this this one-to-one correspondence, right, which basically relates 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 3 to 6, and so on, right? So basically it relates n to 2n. So notice that uh, so we are basically relating every element, right, of the set itself, right? But on the other side, right, we have a proper subset, right, which is the set of even integers, right? So there is a one-to-one correspondence between the set itself, between the set and proper subset, right? And that's why the set is infinite. Right? So you can find such a correspondence for every infinite set. So now infinite sets, right, are further subdivided into two types, right? So there are countable sets and there are uncountable sets. So what's a countable set? Right? So countable set is a set which has a one-to-one correspondence with the set of positive integers. So countable set is an infinite set which you can basically count, right? Whose elements, right, whose members can be counted. Right? So when we say they can be counted, it means that we can assign a positive integer, right, to every member of the set. Right? So we can assign a distinct positive integer to every member of the set. Right? So there is a one-to-one correspondence with the set of positive integers, and therefore all countable sets are infinite. So, for example, right, if you take the set of all integers, right, z, right, then this set is countable. So notice that the set of positive integers itself is countable because the one-to-one correspondence there would be the identity function. But the set of all integers is also countable, right? And here is one way in which we can count or we can assign this one-to-one correspondence between z and the set of positive integers, right? So we basically associate 1, right, with 0, and then we associate with minus I associate 2i, which means that, for example, with minus 1 I'm going to associate 2, and with plus I I'm going to associate 2i plus 1, right? So with plus 1 I'm going to associate 3. So if you once we basically give this correspondence, right, between z and the set of positive integers, I can then enumerate all the elements in z according to their so I can enumerate them in a sequence according to the positive integer with which I have associated them with, right? So for example, 0 is associated with 1, so it comes at the beginning, right? And then minus 1 is associated with 2, 1 is associated with 3, minus 2 is associated with 4, and so on, right? So in this way I can enumerate all of the elements inside. Okay? So that's why it's countable. So other examples of countable sets are the set of all binary strings, which is this set 0, 1 star. And other example is the set of Turing machines, right? So we will see later, right, why both of these are also countable, right? We will basically show this one-to-one correspondence between these sets and the set of positive integers. So let's let's look at why or how the set of binary strings is countable. So to say that the set of binary strings, right, which is this 0 1 star, right? So if you want to prove that this set is countable, then we need to associate a positive integer uh, with every binary string, right? Such that this positive integer should be unique, right? So with every binary string, I can only associate one positive integer, and furthermore, it should also be onto, right? So in the sense that every binary string needs to be associated with an integer, right? So there should be a one-to-one correspondence between the two. So here's a very simple way in which I can do that, right? So we can treat a binary string as a base to integer. So so in that case, with every binary string, I have associated an integer, right? Uh, and I know that with every binary string, right, there must exist an integer. So so that's why the set will be this function, right, is going to be on. However, one of the issues is that there are strings which have leading zeros, right, which will all have the same count, or which will all have the same sequence number, right? So, for example, strings like 101, 0101, and 00101, right? So, if you convert, or if you treat all of these strings as a base to integer, right, then they come up or they result in the same in the same integer, right, which is 5. So, all of them will appear to be the fifth string. So we can resolve this issue by basically prepending a 1 to the string before converting to an integer. So so given the binary string, right, we will simply add a 1, right, prepend a 1 at the very beginning of the string, right, and then we will treat it as a base to integer, right? So we will then convert it to the base to integer, right? So this way, strings like 101, 0101, and 00101. So I will add 1 at the beginning of all of them, right? So in that case, they will all become different strings, right? So, or rather, they will all be converted to different base to integers, right? So 1101 will become the 13th string. 101101 will 10101 will become the 21st string, and so on, right? So this is only for the purpose of assigning an integer, right, to the string, right? So I'm not saying that 101 becomes 1101, right? It's just that in order to assign an integer, right, to the string, I'm going to prepend a 1, right? So so that for every string, right, or for every binary string, we have a unique integer. So now that we have done this, right, we can then sort of enumerate the set of binary strings, right? So there is also epsilon, right? So we map epsilon to 1. Right? So epsilon is mapped to 1, right? And then 0, right? So for example, for 0, I will prepend 1 to it, so that will become 2. Right? For 1, I am also going to prepend a 1 to it, so it becomes 3. And then it becomes 0 0, right? Because then that becomes 4. Then it becomes 0 1, it becomes 5, and so on, right? So yeah. So basically, the order is going to be epsilon, then 0 1 0 0 0 1 1 0 1 1, and so on, right? So in this way, I can enumerate all of the binary strings, right? So this means that the set of all binary strings is also countable, right? And it's also infinite. Right. So not all sets are countable, right? So there are uncountable sets. So when we say that a set is uncountable, that means that there cannot exist this one-to-one correspondence, right, between the set and the set of positive integers. So so here is an example of an uncountable set, right? So we know that the set n, right, which is the set of positive integers, is countable. But if you take its power set, so its power set is the set of all subsets of n. Right? So this power set is uncountable, right? Which means that there cannot exist a one-to-one correspondence between Pn and n. Right? And in order to prove this, right, so we can prove this using this technique called diagonalization. So so it's so this technique is very relevant to us, right? Because later on, right, we will show or we will exhibit a language which is not recursively enumerable through the same technique, right? So that's why let's first introduce this technique of diagonalization, right? So it was proposed by Cantor at the end of the 19th century, right? And it goes as follows, right? So suppose, for the sake of contradiction, assume that this power set of n is countable. Right? So when we say that the power set of n is countable, what we mean is that we can associate a unique positive integer with every subset of n, right? So with every subset of n, I'm associating this unique positive integer. Okay, and this way I can enumerate all of the subsets of n, right? So I can sort of list them in a sequence. Okay, so there exists this one-to-one correspondence, which is this function f, right, from n to pn, right? So when we say that this f is from n to pn, right? So f of 1, right, is going to be the first subset, right, of n according to the sequence. F of 2 is going to be the second one, and so on, right? So in this way, I can enumerate all of the subsets of n. So now what I can do is that I can construct this infinite two-dimensional matrix M to represent f. So let's look at this matrix. Let's look at this matrix M, right? So the rows of this matrix, right, are nothing but the subsets of n, which are basically listed according to this sequence, right? According to the positive integer that is assigned to them, right? So f of 1 is the first subset of n, f of 2 is the second subset of n, f of 3 is the third subset of n, and so on. Okay. So this is the so these are the rows of the matrix, right? The columns of the matrix are nothing but n itself, right? So we have the set of all positive integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, right? So this is clearly an infinite two-dimensional matrix, right? So there are infinite number of rows and there are infinite number of columns here. Okay. So what are the elements in this matrix, right? So the elements of the matrix are all 0 and 1, right? And when we say that an element is 0, right? So when we say that an element Mij is 0, that indicates that this j, right, is not present in f of 5. Right? Well, if Mij is 1, then it indicates that j is present in f of 5. So for example, right, let's look at this first row, right? So this first row says that 1, 3, and 4 are present in f of 1, while 2 and 0 are not present in f of 1. And similarly, the second row, right? So this says that 2 is present in f of 2, and this says that 3 is not present in f of 3. Okay. So note that all of the entries are basically populated, right? So we have not really specified here, but yeah. So all of the entries are known, right? Because each of the subset is known, right? So depending upon what are the elements that are present in that subset, I'm going to place a 1 there, right? And all the elements that are not present in that subset, I'm going to place a 0. Okay. So that's how I define this matrix M. So note that we can only construct this matrix if we have this one-to-one correspondence, right, between n and p on n, right? N and p of n, right, the power set of n, which means that I can enumerate all of the subsets of n. So now, if I can construct this matrix, right, then I look at the diagonal, right, of this matrix. So from this diagonal, I can construct another subset of n that is guaranteed to not appear as a row in the matrix. So we can construct a subset of n that does not appear as a row in the matrix, right? And the way we do it is that we simply complement the diagonal of the matrix. So when we say we complement, right, what we mean is that we look at this diagonal here, right, and whenever an element of this diagonal is 1, right, then that means that corresponding, so let's say here, right, so the element is 1, this means that 1 is present in f of 1, right? So I will, so in that case, the new subset of n that I'm constructing, that's not going to contain 1, right? Similarly, f of 2 is 2, so this new subset that I'm constructing is not going to contain 2, right? While f of 3 is 0, right? So this element is 0, and therefore 3 is going to be present in this new subset that I'm constructing, right? So note that now that since this new subset that I'm constructing is basically complementing the main diagonal, it means that it will basically disagree, right, with every row in this matrix at exactly one position, right, which is in the diagonal position, right? So yeah, so formally we get this set B, which is this new subset of n that I'm constructing, and so this new set B, which is a subset of n, is constructed such that for all n, right, if n belongs to f of n, then n does not belong to B, right? So so this is how we formally represent complementing the diagonal, right? So we say that if n is there in f of n, then n is not there in B, and on the other hand, if n is not present in f of n, then n is present in B, right? So now B cannot be a row in the matrix, right? Because it differs from every row in its diagonal entry. So formally, if B is equal to, so let's say B is a row in the matrix, right? So if B is a row in the matrix, then B will be equal to f of j, right, for some j. But then, right, if j belongs to f of j, right, then by definition j does not belong to B, right? But B is the same as f of j, right? So that means that j does not belong to f of j. So this is a contradiction, right? Because we are saying that j belongs to f of j, but we can show that j does not belong to f of j. So right. So that's why B cannot be a row in this matrix, right? Sorry. Yeah. So this is so for this particular matrix, right? This is the way B is constructed, right? So as I said, so B is going to differ with every row in the matrix in its diagonal entry, right? So since 1 and 2 are not present, or rather since 1 is present in f of 1, that's why it's not present in B. Similarly, 2 is present in f of 2, that's why it's not present in B. But 3 is not present in f of 3, so that's why it's present in B. Similarly, 4 is not present in f of 4, so it's present in B, and so on, right? So the way the B constructed in this manner is going to differ from every row in the matrix, and that's why yeah. So that's why it's not going to be present as a row in the matrix. But we just said that this f is a one-to-one correspondence, right, between n and p of n, right, which means that every subset of n was present as a row in the matrix, right? So that's a contradiction, right? So that's why we cannot have so that's why we cannot have one-to-one correspondence between n and p of n. Right? So hence the power set of n is not countable. So our assumption that p of n is countable is not correct. And we can generalize this, right? So we can say that for any set A, right, so instead of n, I can take any set A, and we can say that there cannot exist a one-to-one correspondence between A and the power set of A. Right? So if A is finite, then this is very straightforward to see, right? But if A is infinite, then I can use Cantor's diagonalization, right, to show that there cannot exist a one-to-one correspondence between A and the power set of A, right? Because yes, otherwise if this function f, right, exists from A to P of A, then I can construct this subset B, right, of A such that it consists of all of those elements which where such that x does not belong to f of x, right? So in that case, so if some f of y is equal to B, right? So if this f exists, then since B is also a subset of A, there must be some y, right, such that f of y is equal to B. But then if y does not belong to f of y, then y is going to belong to B, which means that y will belong to f of y. Right? So this is a contradiction. Right? So that's why such a one-to-one correspondence cannot exist. Okay. So this is just sort of reiterating what we did, right, with n and this p of n, right? But for any general set A. So a corollary of this is that the set of languages over 0, 1 is uncountable, right? So remember that every language, right, is basically a subset, right? Is a subset of strings, right? So every language is going to be a subset of 0, 1 star, which means that the set of all languages is nothing but the power set of 0, 1 star, right? So we know that 0 1 star is countable, right? And we just proved that there cannot exist a one-to-one correspondence between A and between any set A and P of A, right? So between 0 1 star and the set of languages over 0 1 star, there cannot exist a one-to-one correspondence, right? Which means that the set of languages is also going to be uncountable. Okay. So are there any questions so far regarding the Cantor's diagonalization? Okay. So far we have seen, right? So what we have done today, right, is we just shown, right, that the set of languages uh, over the binary alphabet, right, or over any alphabet is not countable. Right? So now let's look at the set of Turing machines, right, that are present. Right? So how many Turing machines can be constructed? Uh, so so we will see that the set of Turing machines is actually countable, right? Uh, and we will prove this by encoding every Turing machine as a binary string. Right? So this is very similar to what we do, right, in every day, right? So we write programs, right? So when we write programs, so let's say you write a C program or a Java program, right? So the C or Java program is written as a text, right? It's a .c file or it's a .java file, and then it's converted into binary, right? So which means that a program itself, right, is basically represented as a binary string, right? So in that way, right, even the Turing machine is nothing but a program, right? Because it just says, right, that it's a program which basically has the specific structure, right? That in every transition, right, you can you look at the current state, and you look at the current symbol under the read head, and then you can change the state, and you can change the symbol under the read head, and then you can move left or right, right? So it's just a string of instructions, right? So that's why you can also encode the Turing machine as a binary string. So we restrict ourselves to Turing machines with input alphabet 0 1, right? So this is fine, because if you have any other alphabet, right, then it can always be encoded in binary. So that's why we only consider Turing machines with input alphabet 0 1. So let's look at how we can encode every transition of a Turing machine in binary. So there are many ways to do this, right? But here is a very simple way to do it. Right? So we assign positive integers to the three classes of elements that are involved in transitions. Right? So remember that every transition, right, involves a state, it involves a symbol, which is a symbol of the tape alphabet, and it involves a direction, right? So we are going to assign positive integers to all of these three things. Right? So for states, let's say we assign this notation Q1 for the start state, Q2 for the final state. So let's just assume a single final state, Q3, and so on, right? For symbols, I know that 0 and 1, right, are both part of the tape alphabet, right, because they are part of the input alphabet. So I'm going to assign the symbol x1 to 0. I'm going to assign the notation x1 to 0. I'm going to assign the notation x2 to 1. Blank is another symbol that is guaranteed to be part of the tape alphabet, and that's different from 0 and 1. Right? So that's why I'm going to assign this particular notation x3 for blank, x4 for and x4 onwards for the other symbols of the tape alphabet. Right? So, and for direction, I'm going to assign D1 to L and D2 to R. Right? So in a sense, right, with every state, symbol, and direction, we have assigned an integer. Right? So for example, with states like, so I have assigned integers like 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3 here, and so on, right? So now that we have assigned an integer, right, to every state, symbol, and direction, right, I know that if you take an arbitrary transition, right, of this Turing machine, then this is going to be of this form, right? So it's going to be of the form delta of qi, xj is equal to qk, xl, and tm, right? So if the Turing machine is in state qi, and if it sees xj under the readout, then it's going to move to the state qk. It's going to replace xj with xl, and then it's going to move in the direction dm, right? So here is where we basically reap the advantages, right, of assigning integers, right? Because all of these, right, basically become integers, right? So this I, j, k, l, and m are what are going to actually differentiate this particular, or actually indicate this particular transition, right? So we can represent this particular transition by this string, right? So the position, right, of so first of all, right, so this qi is represented by I number of zeros, right? And the position of this particular of a particular element, right, is basically preserved, right, whenever we do the encoding, right? So qi xj appears first, right? So therefore qi is encoded as I number of zeros, xj is encoded as as j number of zeros, then qk is encoded as k number of zeros. Similarly, xl by l number of zeros, and dm by m number of zeros, right? And there is a differentiating one between all of these components, right? So this rule, right, or rather this particular string uniquely encodes the rule, right, or the move, right? Since that, so if you have this move, then this is the only way in which I can encode it, right? By so if we have this particular strategy, right, of assigning a positive integer to every state, symbol, and direction, right, and preserving the position of each element in the rule. Okay. So in this way, for every yeah, so note that since the integers are all greater than 0, there cannot be two consecutive ones in this string, right? Because we started numbering all of the state, symbols, and directions with positive integers only, right? So we started with 1, and that's why there will be at least 1 0, right, between any two ones. So that's why we cannot have two consecutive ones, right? So in this way, I can encode all of the transitions of the Turing machine. Okay. So then we can represent a Turing machine simply by concatenating the codes for each of its transitions, right? But we'll separate them by 1 as punctuation, right? So each of these transitions is going to have all of the 5 components, right? So in order to separate them, we will use the string 1 and the 1 string, right, is guaranteed not to be present inside each inside the encoding of each transition itself, right? So that's why we can safely use it, right? So this code 1, code 2, code 3, so on are basically encodings of each of the transitions of the Turing machine. They are separated by 1. So in this way, right, given a Turing machine, I can come up with this unique encoding, and this unique encoding defines the Turing machine, right? Means that if I know this encoding, then I know all of the transitions of the Turing machine, right? Which means I know the Turing machine itself. So now, right, so now that we have converted a Turing machine, right, into a binary string, right, I know that I can convert a binary string to an integer. So we saw this earlier, right? So given a binary string, we basically simply prepend a 1, right? So we add a 1 at the beginning of the string, and then we treat the resulting string as a base 2 integer, right? So this is the strategy that we used in order to prove that the set of all binary strings is countable, right, by assigning a unique integer to every binary string, right? But now I know that for every Turing machine, I can also so every Turing machine also has a binary encoding, right? So for a Turing machine, I have a binary encoding, and then this binary encoding itself, right, this binary string can be converted into a base 2 integer, right? Which means I can assign an integer to every Turing machine. Okay. Now it's possible that, for example, right, I may actually assign the same integer, right, to two Turing machines, right? But that's fine, right? So what we want to show, right, is that all the Turing machines can basically be enumerated. Okay. So hence this TM-MI, right? So this M subscript I is the TM with encoding I, right? So what we mean is that if you take a Turing machine M, right, if you then encode it, right, in a binary, as a binary string, and then you convert that binary string to an integer, then it's going to have so let's say that the corresponding integer you get is I, right? So then this machine M becomes MI, right? So it becomes basically the ith Turing machine. So MI is the TM with encoding I. So now, so I know that I can convert a Turing machine to an integer, right? But for every integer, right, does there exist a Turing machine? That may not happen, right? So if you take some arbitrary integer I and then you convert it into its binary representation, okay, and then maybe you also prepend a 1 to it, right? But then it may not make any sense, right, as a Turing machine, right? Because I know that a Turing machine, right, or rather the binary encoding of the Turing machine has a very specific format, right? So it has this bunch of moves, right, which are separated by 1 1, and then in every move all of the components are separated by 1, right? But if you take an arbitrary integer, it will not and then its binary representation will not be according to this format, right? So if I doesn't make a sense as a TM, then I simply assume that this mi is a fixed TM, right, which basically accepts nothing. uh, so I can just consider, for example, a TM with just one state, which does nothing, right? So in which case it doesn't really accept anything, right? So a TM with no final state, for example, won't accept anything. So now, right, what I can do, right, is that, so basically so I can now enumerate all of the Turing machines, right? So for every integer I, right, I can basically come up with this Turing machine mi, right? So all of these Turing machines can now be enumerated, right? So now I am basically enumerating them, right? So I'm now creating this table of acceptance, right, where the rows of this table actually correspond to all of the Turing machines, right, which are enumerated according to their in sequence, right, according to the positive integers that are assigned to them, right? So we have m1, m2, m3, m4, m5, and so on, right? So when we say m1, right, so this is basically the Turing machine with encoding 1, right? So it may happen that that there is no valid Turing machine with encoding 1, right, according to this encoding scheme that you have defined, in which case it will just be the fixed Turing machine which doesn't accept anything, right? But it's guaranteed, right, that every Turing machine is going to be present, right, in this particular in this as a row in this particular table, right? Because I know that every Turing machine has a fixed binary encoding, right? Which means that there exists an integer I for which is basically going to be the encoding of that Turing machine, right? So therefore every Turing machine will be present as a row in the matrix, okay? So many Turing machines may be repeated, but that's fine, okay? Rather this fixed TM is definitely going to be repeated many times, but that is fine, okay? So the columns of this particular table are nothing but all the binary strings, right? So I know that all of the binary strings can also be enumerated, right? So this is the set 0 1 star, and so we saw that this 1, right, is basically epsilon, 0, this 2 is 3 is the binary string 0, the 3 is binary string 1, 4 is binary string 0 0, and so on, okay? This is 0 1, this is 1 0, and so on, okay? So remember that the input alphabet we assume to be 0 1, right? So the input alphabet of every Turing machine is 0 1, which means that so now the elements of this table, right, are going to say, right, whether or not the string is part of the matrix, or rather a string is part of the language of the Turing machine or not, okay? So this x, right, so for every row, right, and for every column, right, we have this element x, right, and this x can be either 0 or 1. So if this x is 0, it means that the ith Turing machine, right? So let's say that this is the element ij, right? So this is in row I and column j, and this means that the ith Turing machine does not accept the jth string. And if it is 1, it means that the ith Turing machine does accept the jth string. Okay? So this means that every row, right, in this matrix, right, is basically going to represent the language of the corresponding Turing machine, right? So for example, right, so some of these elements may be 0, some of these elements may be 1, right? And whenever it is 1, it means that the corresponding string, right, is present in the language of the Turing machine. If it is 0, it means that the corresponding string is not present in the language of the Turing machine, okay? So since we have said that all of the Turing machines are basically have been or rather all of the Turing machines are present as rows in this matrix or in this table, it means that all of the recursively enumerable languages. Right? So remember that the class of recursively enumerable languages are the languages which are accepted by some Turing machine. Right? So all of the recursively enumerable languages are present as rows in this matrix. So whenever we have a matrix or a table of this form, right, I can use diagonalization, right? So which means that I can now take the diagonal, right, of this particular table, right, or this particular matrix, right, and then I can complement the diagonal, right? So when I complement the diagonal, what I will get, right? So I will get another language, right? So I will get a set of strings, right? And this language is going to be different from every language, right? Which is represented by a row in this matrix, right? Because it's going to be different from every row in this matrix in its diagonal element, right? So whenever a table like this one, we can diagonalize it. So we construct this sequence D, which is obtained by complementing each bit along the major diagonal. So formally, this D is defined as A1, A2, dot dot dot, where A1 is 0 if the II table entry is 1 and vice versa. So now, right, so this particular D that we get, right, it's just a sequence of zeros and ones, but it represents a language, right? So it represents a set of strings, and this set of strings or this language cannot be another row, right, in the table, right? So we said that each row represents a recursively enumerable language, right? It represents the language accepted by a Turing machine. So this diagonal or this complement of the diagonal that we get cannot be a row, right? So this is again the diagonalization argument, right? That if it were the jth row, then so suppose it were the jth row, then that cannot be, right? Because D is going to disagree with the jth row at the jth column. Yeah, because we said that if the entry at jj, right, is present or is 1, then it will be 0 in D, and if it is not present, which means it is 0, then it will be 1 in D, right? So D is guaranteed to disagree with the jth row as well. So this will happen for any row, which means that D cannot be a row in this particular table, right? So this means that D cannot be a language that is so D cannot be a language that is accepted by a Turing machine, right? Because we said that all of the Turing machines have been enumerated, right, in this particular table, right? Which means that all of the recursively enumerable languages are there, right? But we have just constructed a new language which cannot be which cannot be a row in the matrix, right? So which cannot be a recursively enumerable language. So let's look at this diagonalization language, right? So this is the first non-recursively enumerable language, right, that we have seen, right? So this LD, right, is the language which is the set of all words W or all binary strings W, such that this W is the ith binary string, and MI, right, does not accept W, right? So formally we can write this as W such that W does not belong to L of MW. Okay. So when we say MW, right, so this MW is a Turing machine uh, whose binary encoding, right, is W, right? And W is a string itself, right? So we are basically considering the set of all strings, right, which if viewed as a Turing machine, right, then those Turing machines don't accept their own code, right? So remember that the code of this Turing machine, right, is basically the encoding of the Turing machine, right? So we are considering the set of all Turing machines which don't accept their own code, right? And this is the set of and this is the set and this set of strings, right? This language is not recursively enumerable. So we have shown that LD is not a recursively enumerable language, which means it has no TM. Okay. So are there any questions regarding so far regarding this LD? Okay. Right. So now let's move on to the second question, right? So we have demonstrated a language which is not recursively enumerable, right? But there is still this question of languages which are recursively enumerable but which are not recursive, right? So from a practical point of view, we are only interested in recursive languages, right? And therefore we want to know, right, whether or not there are languages which are RE but which are not recursive, right? So towards that end, let's define this concept of a problem, right? So we saw this concept, right, very early, right? In fact, I think in the first or second lecture of the course, right? So we said that. So basically, we said that any problem, right? So we want to solve problems using computers, right? So any problem, right, can always be represented in a yes or no instance, right? So this is a decision problem, right? So any problem becomes a decision problem. So for example, if I want to sort an array, right? So I can represent this as a decision problem by saying that, okay, I'm given one array and I'm given another array, and is the second array a sorted representation, or is the second array a sorted form, right, of the first array, right? So in this way, I can represent any problem as a decision problem. This is a yes no problem, right? So problem is a yes no question about an infinite set of possible instances, right? So in the sorting problem, right, for example, it would be an infinite set of pairs of arrays. Okay. So here is another example of a problem, right? So does the graph G have Hamiltonian cycle, which is a cycle that touches each node exactly once? Okay. So this is a problem, right? And the instances of this problem are the set of all are the set of all undirected graphs. Okay. So each undirected graph is an instance of the Hamiltonian cycle problem. Right? Now, some of the graphs may have a Hamiltonian cycle, some of the graphs may not have a Hamiltonian cycle, right? So which means that this problem is basically going to is basically going to partition the set of undirected graphs into two different sets, right? Into two different subsets. Right? There will be the yes instances and there will be the no instances. Okay. So the yes instances, right, actually become the language. So in this way, a problem becomes a language, right? So each string encodes some instance, and then the string is in the language if and only if the answer to this instance of the problem is yes. Okay. So in the graph example, right? So the problem was that does this graph have a Hamiltonian cycle? Right? So which means that so if you encode every graph as a string, right? Let's say you encode undirected graphs as string, right? Then the set of all graphs, right? Right. So that is the set of all instances of this problem, right? And then you consider all the yes instances, right? Which are all the graphs which do have a Hamiltonian cycle, and they become and they basically become a language, right? So they are the subset of the set of all instances. Okay, so the string, so you can apply this for any arbitrary problem, right? So any arbitrary decision problem. So we know that any problem can be converted into a decision problem, and then any decision problem is going to define a language, right? Which is the set of all yes instances of the particular problem. Okay. So we also saw this. We have seen this non-recursively enumerable language, right? So this non-recursively enumerable language is actually a problem about Turing machines, right? So we can think of this language LD as a problem as well, right? So remember that. So we said that a problem, right, basically has to have a set of instances. Okay, and then with each instance, I have either yes or no, right? And then the yes instances become the language. Right? So in this case, all the instances, right, are basically all the Turing machines. Okay, so you consider the set of all possible Turing machines; they become instances, and then the yes instances are those such that the Turing machine does not accept its own code, right? So if you encode the Turing machine as a binary string, if this particular encoding, right, is not part of the language of the Turing machine, okay? So those Turing machines become the yes instances of this problem, right? While the other becomes the no instances. So does the TM not accept its own code, right? So this is the problem representation of the language LD. So we can also think about LD as a problem over binary strings, right? So if you consider all possible binary strings, right? So here the set of instances then become the set of binary strings. Okay, and then for this particular representation, right, the problem becomes that if the binary string W is interpreted as a Turing machine MW, then does MW accept W or not? Okay. So if the answer is no, then it's present in the language. If the answer is yes, then it's not present in the language. So I should probably say, does MW not accept W? Because we are considering yes instances to be the language. So any questions regarding this concept of a problem? Okay. So the reason that we have introduced again this concept of problem, right, is that uh, we want to formally define decidability, right? So let's look at which problems are decidable, right? So a problem is called decidable if there is an algorithm to answer it. So this is a very so this statement looks very generic, right? But the way we have defined a problem in an algorithm, right? That's what sort of relates this particular statement, right, to what we have been studying, right? So recall that an algorithm is a Turing machine that basically halts on all inputs, right? So accepted or not. So it's basically a total Turing machine, and we just saw that a problem is nothing but a language, right? So it's basically a set of strings, right, which are the yes instances of the problem. Okay. So now, right, so we said that the problem is decidable if there is an algorithm to answer it. So a problem is a language, right, and an algorithm is a Turing machine. And so what we are essentially saying is that the language must have a total Turing machine, right? So the language must have an algorithm, right, which means that this language must be a recursive language, right? So therefore, decidable problem is the same as a recursive language. Okay. So a problem is a language, right? And if it is decidable, then there must be an algorithm to answer it. Right? So which means that this algorithm is always guaranteed to halt on all inputs. So it must be a Turing machine that halts on all inputs. But this is exactly the set of languages that are accepted by algorithms, right, or total Turing machines is nothing but the set of recursive languages, right? So therefore, decidable problems are is the same. So saying that a problem is decidable it means that its language is going to be recursive. Okay. So and the opposite is also true, right? So when we say that a problem is undecidable, right, that means that it is not recursive, right? So it means that there cannot exist a total Turing machine in order to answer that problem, right? So note that an undecidable problem, right, can be recursively enumerable, right, which means that it may have a Turing machine, but this Turing machine is guaranteed to not be total. So otherwise the problem is undecidable. So here is a bullseye picture of what I'm saying about, right? So a decidable so the set of decidable problems are the set of all recursive languages, right? So which are basically languages which are accepted by a total Turing machine. Okay, and now I have this so I have this second sort of circle, right, which is encircling the first circle, right? And this is the set of all recursively enumerable languages. So these are languages which are accepted by some Turing machine. Okay. Right. So we know that every recursive language is a recursively enumerable language, right? Because after all, if a language is recursive, right, it means that it's accepted by some Turing machine. It's rather accepted by total Turing machine, which means that it's also accepted by Turing machine, right? So we know that every recursive language is recursively enumerable, right? We have yet to demonstrate any language in this particular section, right, which is language which is RE but which is not recursive. That will do that, right? And we have seen a language which is outside this set, right? So which is this language LD, right? So this is not even a recursively enumerable language, right? So uh, so so uh, right, so this language LD is clearly undecidable, right? According to our definition of decidability, right? So it's not even RE, which means it's definitely not recursive. Okay. Uh, However, languages which are not RE, so languages which are not RE are definitely undecidable, but there could be languages which are RE but which are not recursive. They will also be undecidable. Okay. So yeah, so in the next lecture, right, we will basically demonstrate a language which is in this section, right? It's a language which is RE but which is not recursive. So yeah, so we'll end the lecture here today, and thank you.